All right, okay, so we are looking then today at all the characters in an Inspector Calls, but we are looking at the idea of characterisation, not just simply telling you what these characters do, and that's really important for the upper levels in this part of the exam, that you can talk about how Priestley has constructed these characters. They haven't happened by accident, they are constructs of what he has created, and certain things that he's put in there, how he's written about them, how they talk, how they act, all goes into their characterisation. Okay? And that is the fact that you can see that there are methods in play here. Okay? We'll talk through each of the characters bit by bit. Okay? We'll look at links between them. We'll think about the authorial intention. Why did Priestley do what he did, and what is he trying to do? Okay? Opportunities for you to kind of contribute, definitely, but we're thinking the whole time about why he's done what he's doing.
So, yeah, I think what Sis just said is really important. It's characterisation that we're thinking about. What has Priestley done and why? And the people who are going to do well in this exam are those who can think outside of the text, not inside of it. So not just what do characters do and say and how are they, but why have they done that, or rather why has Priestley have them do those things. So I'm going to introduce you to this term. You may already be really familiar with this. If so, that's great. The term is allegory, and it's a descriptor that we use for any piece of art. It could be a painting, it could be a play, it could be a piece of poetry that has a moral meaning or message, essentially. And the way that an allegory is different to any other piece of art that might have a moral is that characters or figures within it specifically represent either ideas or qualities, or even sometimes people who exist in the real world. So an allegory in the 1500s was usually a play in which characters had names like chastity or piety or kindness, and then they acted the way that you would expect characters with those names to act. So they were plays about morality. This allegory is more sophisticated than that. In this play, the characters allegorically symbolise both ideas, like selfishness, for example. Mr. Burling is a good kind of symbol of that, but also more specific, narrow, political types of people. And so made an interesting point, which I'm going to pass over to you actually, about how sometimes they're a bit hammy for that reason.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talked about the fact that it's a didactic play. The fact didactic means that it is there to teach. It gives you a message, and it's trying to communicate something directly to the audience. Obviously, the audience will interpret and respond to it personally, but there's no doubt that Priestley has a very clear message that he wants to get across. Okay? He's trying to teach you something, and that is what we call by didactic. And you know that this play is performed in real time. Okay, so it's in the 3 acts over a meal, the dinner time that they're having. So you haven't got very long at all. You've got about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours before that. You haven't got long to develop these characters. So that means that he has to be able to get his message across very quickly. That means a lot of the characters aren't fully rounded, they aren't fully developed, and they're a little bit obvious sometimes. So Mr. Burling, when we get on to in a moment, we know he is the old generation, we know he is very old-fashioned in his views, and he's very extreme in that, isn't he? He's very over the top, he's hyperbolic, he's very bombastic and pompous in the way he talks about all the things. He's quite extreme. There's no doubt about what he thinks, okay? And we see that with a lot of the characters. They're almost stereotypes of themselves in order to get their message across quite quickly.
And I think it's worth noting as well, contextually, this is really important, that Priestley is a very political and politicised playwright. So he's not only a playwright, but he's also a Labour Party activist. And at the time that he wrote this play, it's the mid-1940s, it's the end of the Second World War, so he writes it in 1945. I think it's first performed in 1946, but it's a very immediately post-war context, and it's the first time in British history that a Labour government had been voted into office. So essentially this play is part of his political agenda. It reflects his political beliefs, for example, about industrialists like Mr. Burling and what type of people they are. And it also serves as a reminder, I think, and this is kind of crucial, and a warning, fundamentally, which you see echoed in the inspector's speech towards the end of the play, a warning not to go back to how it used to be. So essentially he's saying, look how far we've come, we've elected a Labour government, we've got, for the first time perhaps, a government who are representing the interests of the working class, people like Eva Smith, people like Edna. Let's not allow ourselves to regress to the way it was in 1912 when, you know, old world Tories were in charge and the systems were so much more unfair, as he saw it.
Okay, so we'll start kind of thinking about the characters in order, and it is it's quite significant that we start off with Arthur Burling. So we know at the start of the play, it's in the evening celebrating the engagement of Sheila and Gerald, but we have this very traditional patriarchal family where at the head of the family is Mr. Burling, so at the head of the table, and it's symbolic that he starts, okay? He starts with his opening speech, he is in charge of this family, and that sets a tone straight away. Okay, so we're in no doubt that in his eyes anyway, he's in control of the family. We know as an audience later on that that's ironic, isn't it? Because he hasn't really got control of this family. There's lots going on beneath the surface that he hasn't got a clue about. But to him, he's in control. Also, symbolically, he's the first one that's been spoken to by the inspector, the first one's a challenge, and that's the sense of that he comes first in the pecking order of the family and also the society. He's an odd man, though. He's an odd man, and he's not particularly comfortable with himself. And he comes across overzealously, you might say, the fact that he's got something to prove. He's not naturally of the upper class. He has married somebody better than him. We know that Mrs. Burling comes from old money, comes from a better family. And he talks about how the Croft family might think that Sheila is kind of not good enough for Gerald, and he has kind of concerns that his own wife's family might have thought that about himself. And the fact that he's not particularly kind of old money suggests that some of his manners are a little bit crass. So, for example, he makes a big deal about the quality of the port that they're drinking and the fact that they're all wearing white tie. White tie is really symbolic. It's more formal even than black tie. Black tie was seen to be a little bit kind of casual for the time. He's at home having dinner, but he's making the effort to say, look, we have status, we have all of this in our life. And actually it's very, very obvious. He makes a big deal as well about how he speaks to Edna. He's very patronising towards Edna because he's maintaining that distance between himself and the staff. He might not previously have had staff earlier in his life, but he has them now. The way he speaks is not particularly defined, it's not particularly eloquent, whereas we see with Mrs. Burling, she's very clipped, very abrupt, very kind of no-nonsense, whereas Mr. Burling is much more bombastic in the way he speaks, much more aggressive in the way he speaks, and actually kind of loses his sense of performance throughout what he does. Okay, he talks to people in this really rash way, and he comes across as really arrogant. We know the whole time as well that there is a sense of dramatic irony in here. He thinks he has it sorted. He thinks he knows exactly what's going to happen in the world. He thinks he knows about the economy. He thinks he knows about what's going to happen in Europe. But actually, as an audience in 1946, we know that war is on the way. We know that revolution is imminent in Russia. We know that the Titanic sank. So all his certainties, and he says it really with a sense of certainty, are flawed. Okay, and this makes him seem like quite a comic character. Yeah, he's quite sad, isn't he, in many ways, that he feels so certain, and it's open with that. There's never a sense that actually this is a man who really gets the world that he lives in. Okay, he also has a sense of false superiority. So he talks about the things that he does, and he talks about what he does for the good of the people. He thinks he looks after the workers in his factory. Okay, he says that he provides for them, and if he wasn't there, they wouldn't have a job, and therefore that gives him an authority, a right to kind of act how he wants to. But we know that this is selective responsibility. He's deciding what he wants to do, because actually he's not really bothered about these workers. He's not really bothered about the fact that by sacking Eva Smith, he has set off a course of events that will lead to her downfall. And actually, he is simply trying to reinforce his own ideologies that are flawed in many ways. He wants that constant reassurance.
And I think it's worth making, especially if you're aiming at that top end, thinking about allegory, thinking about how these characters are symbolic. Burling's exploitation of his workers, which is what it is what Priestley suggests to us anyway. Actually, there are parallels between that exploitation, like of Eva, for example, when she's working in his factory, and the sexual exploitation that Gerald makes of her, and Eric as well. There's a kind of suggestion, I think, by Priestley that the bodies of poor people, especially poor women, are commodified. They're turned into products, basically, by the rich for their use, whether it's in a factory or whether it's through prostitution. the bodies of the poor are kind of for sale and they're exploited, and that seems to be a theme that he returns to. And that kind of lack of humanity that he sees in his workers could be arguably related to Priestley's own background. So he grew up in a town in West Yorkshire where, and I can't remember what it's called, but it begins with a B and ends with a Y, so it's got a kind of connection to that Brumley. It's not there, it's a very small place, but anyway, we can Google it and find out. But the point is, the place where he grew up, boys, is certainly echoed and reflected in the setting that he chooses for the play. So arguably, the character of Eva Smith is based on the hundreds and hundreds of women and girls who he would have seen trooping past his own house twice a day on their way to the factory and on their way home again, and also the character of Mr. Burling, the sort of small town parochial figure who really thinks a lot of himself because he's a magistrate and he's friends with the police officers and so on and so forth. Again, our writer will have known people like that, seen people like that. The factory owner who was based in his own town probably had a big house just like the Burling's house. So all of these figures they're caricatures in a way, but they're drawn from real life. These are all inspired by Priestley's own life and experiences and the world as he perceived it, which I think was grossly unfair. Shall we move along to the next character? So, a final kind of thought about what he symbolises, what does he represent?
I mean, it all to me comes down to this lack of insight and this arrogance and this misjudgment of the world. Whereas, for me, and we'll talk about Mrs. Burling in a moment, she's kind of very aware of the world that she lives in, and she's kind of trying to maintain her status and makes very decisive decisions to maintain that position. Whereas Mr. Burling is oblivious to all of this. He's oblivious to what he's doing, and it's this arrogance that everything will be okay. There's also an echo of this hyper-masculinity, which we'll talk about with Gerald and we'll talk about with Eric, that actually he's got no understanding of the importance of the women in his life as well.
Okay, so Sybil Burling. I'm going to start the same way I did actually last week and the week before, because I do think this point bears repeating. That name Sybil is really significant. I don't know how familiar you are with Greek mythology, but in Greek myth, the Sybil or the Sibyls are women who have the gift of foresight and prophecy. So they're sort of almost magical creatures who can see into the future and predict it. It's, I think, deliberate that she's been called that, she's been given that name, because actually our character is absolutely lacking in foresight. She can't see what's in front of her face. She doesn't realise that her own son is implicated, even when she's pressing the inspector to do his duty and bring this young man to justice. She still doesn't see. And she can't see, I guess, allegorically, if we think of her as a symbol of the upper classes, she doesn't see the future coming for her. And kind of this is, again, ties into the interesting setting and timing of this play. Written in 45, set in 1912, Priestley, as the writer, and we as the audience, and of course we're in the future again, can see what is coming for people like her. We know that really the end of the Second World War was really the end of the old world for those rich people. It was the end of servants, pretty much. It was the end of the kind of old, really, really regimented and stratified class systems that had existed for so long. After the war, they really fell away and things changed, arguably because of the Labour government, because of the Labour movement, all of that sort of stuff. And she doesn't see that coming, but Priestley does, and he therefore makes her look foolish, in the same way that Mr. Burling looks foolish for not being able to see ahead. You know, the Titanic's absolutely unsinkable. There's, the Germans don't want war. All of that stuff is to remind us that the rich, Priestley believes, can't see what's right in front of them, and they don't want to see the truth because they don't want to imagine a world where they don't maintain their position. But we see it's fire and blood and anguish that's waiting for them if they don't change, essentially.
And this character is what I'd refer to as emotionally impotent throughout the play. So she keeps this stiff upper lip all the way through and refuses to acknowledge any emotional response to the death of Eva/Daisy, has no kind of remorse for what's happened. But as soon as there's an implication to her family and realises the what's happened with the family in terms of Eric, she absolutely loses it and she's hysterical. And this idea that symbolically, that's the fragility of her life. She's created this sense of superiority, this status, this sense of being better than everybody else. But it's all very, very fragile, isn't it? It's all on a knife edge, and it's all going to come crumbling down. She cannot regulate herself, she cannot read people. They do not understand what these working class people do. And she's an absolutely hopeless character. Absolutely hopeless character, because the fact that she is so quick to go back to her old ideas, and she's been so hysterical about Eric, so hysterical about what's happened, but then realises that this was, in her mind, a hoax. She's very quick to reject her ideas. What we often overlook is the fact that she never acknowledges that she has potentially caused the death of her own grandchild. Yeah, by not helping Daisy Renton, by not helping this woman who was pregnant by her son, she has inevitably killed her own grandson. But she can never make that connection beyond her own status.
And actually, if we extrapolate that and think outside of the text again and think, well, what's she symbolic of? And she's symbolic of these old money traditional types. She's a Victorian, really, isn't she? If she's a middle-aged woman in 1912, she's been raised in a totally different system to that which we recognise now. But she's part of the old upper class. And of course, she doesn't recognise that this is her grandchild that she's killing, because what Priestley is really trying to say is the upper classes do not recognise nor take responsibility for their obligations to the working class. They act as though they're aliens that live in a completely separate sphere from them, when what Priestley is trying to remind them is we are all part of a community, we all depend on one another. And exactly as Burling rejects bees in a hive, Priestley says, no, we are bees in a hive. And some of us might have more power than others, but that doesn't mean that we're not connected. She, of course, though, as he kind of believes about the upper classes, can't see that and won't see that because she doesn't want to share what she's got, basically. You know, she has the opportunity, doesn't she, to help Eva Smith, to be charitable even, which is an old Victorian idea. The idea of the rich philanthropist is born out of a Victorian sense of kind of Christian obligation, which is really, I would say, more about showing off your wealth. You know, I've donated this much to a hospital and I've donated this much to a workhouse. And she purports to be like that. She has this charity that she's set up, but it's empty promises, isn't it? Because actually, when it comes down to showing some kindness and humanity, she can't do it, because she can't actually, in the same way that Burling can't, and arguably the same way that Gerald can't and Eric can't for a period, she can't see that Eva Smith is even human like her. She doesn't recognise her as being in any way equivalent to her, I don't think. She just sees her as one of the poor, you know, the same way she sees her servants. And that's what Sheila is able to get past, isn't it? These girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. She makes that leap very early, where her mother can't. Okay. Do you want me to keep going with that, or shall I move on to someone else? Okay. So Mrs. Burling in the play then, old money, traditional Victorian upper class values. Sheila, here we go.
Possibly the most important character in the play, okay? And this is a character who is transformative, okay? Will alter throughout the play. Eric, to some degrees, will change and develop, but Sheila goes through an almost full transformation throughout the play. And it's the idea of hope. So we talk about Mr. and Mrs. Burling being hopeless characters. We've got this young, turns out to be intelligent, articulate woman who has a lot to offer, and it's a hope for society. So like this keeps coming back to in 1946, we have lost all these men in the war. This society has to be rebuilt. All these women have been empowered in the war. They've been given important roles. They've kept families going. They've kept businesses going. They've kept the country going. And Priestley, in many ways, is showing actually our future is in these women. These women will help rebuild this country. They have some power. And by the end of it, she is the inspector. She's inspecting herself, she's inspecting her family, and she's that voice piece. So we talked about Priestley, the inspector, and you put Sheila on the end of that, definitely. And this idea that you have to keep giving that message. And to get that message across of something being transformative is we have a character at the start who is very unlikable. Yeah? She's precocious, she's spoiled, she's immature. The way she refers to her family as daddy and mummy, very, very evocative of the kind of the stereotypical upper class girl, rather than a woman, I suppose we might say, or somebody who has completely relied upon them, there to please. Her traditional role in life would be to be brought up, potentially by a governess at home, not experienced to the world, find the best possible match that she can, be married, have children, and replicate the life of Mrs. Burling. And she's on course to do that in the first act. Yeah, talks about the size of the engagement ring. She is removed from the room with Mrs. Burling because that's what women do. And she's got this life of kind of voicelessness. But actually, symbolically, that challenges as soon as the inspector comes, because it goes Mr. Burling, then Sheila as the next person who's been interrogated. And it's important that we have Sheila being interrogated next, because she needs time to reflect and learn. And we see very early on that possibility that you can change. If it'd been Gerald the other way round, he ums and ahs about it, okay? And Eric ums and ahs about it. But Sheila is very quick to show remorse, very quick to show that he has made a mistake. And the inspector's making that point again and again, that the young can do that, the younger generation can change. And once you can do that, it's okay.
I think when you used the word hopeful earlier, that's key for me with Sheila, that she's, for in that allegorical sense of who she symbolises. Yes, she symbolises young women, but not all young women. She's not symbolic of the working class, for example. She's symbolic of a certain type of woman who has the privilege, through her wealth essentially and education, of being able to make people listen to her. And she does do that. Although her family are slow to listen, Eric does and ends up saying, I agree with Sheila. So she has some kind of reach, the kind of reach that Eva tried to have when she went on strike but wasn't able to have. So Priestley kind of reminds his audience, particularly I think the women in his audience, that the new kind of political activism that the 40s demanded, this new socialism, needed to be led by women as well as men. He was basically saying we can't allow women to take a back seat as they have in the past, like Mrs. Burling, who says, oh, you'll just have to get used to that, just as I did. He's saying they have to step up, and Sheila is a perfect kind of symbol of that, because by the end of the play, you know, she goes from, at the start, she shows a little bit of rebellion, even from the very moment she speaks, when she says, I jolly well should think not, Gerald. I'd hate you to turn out one of those purple-faced old men. So she's kind of rejecting the idea of him becoming like her father. So she, therefore, is rejecting being her mother in many ways. And then by the end of the play, the very last thing she says is, I must think. So that ideology, this kind of embracing of thought and intellectualism and reading and self-improvement, is what led people at that time, at the turn of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, to refer to this new woman, and that's with a capital N and a capital W in inverted commas. And the new woman, with Sheila essentially, was the politicised, educated, opinionated young woman who was rejecting the sort of patriarchal and traditional impositions of the past. And so her giving back the wedding ring, for example, is another symbol of that. Arguably, she is what I would call a proto-feminist. So we wouldn't use the term feminist to describe her, because the term feminism wasn't really coined or used then. Nevertheless, we'd call her a proto-feminist, because she's like an early example of feminist thought in literature. Even though she's been created by a male writer, she represents ideas about female empowerment and so on and so forth.
And definitely make the link between Eva Smith and Sheila. They're parallel characters, they're the same age. And I think you get a sense that Sheila is very aware that it's only by chance that she is who she is in terms of society, the opportunities that she has. And they are, remember when the inspector says that there are millions and millions of Eva Smiths, but there are millions and millions of women as well. And it's that idea that they are the same, okay? And in many ways, what this is talking about in terms of that kind of carrying the mantle, needing women to have the voice, could you argue that Sheila is taking on the work of what Eva Smith started to do? Eva was rejecting men as well. Remember, she was rejecting Mr. Burling's kind of control, and the fact that challenging that, the fact that she was an independent woman. When she's gone, Sheila takes up that mantle, and in many ways is kind of seeing herself in Eva Smith, and she's a voice that Eva Smith could never have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think my class will be rolling their eyes with this because I've heard it so many times. But the classic quotations that are the easy ones to remember for Sheila, and for thinking about structure of the play more generally, are that Sheila begins life at the start of the play referring to her father as Daddy. Then she starts calling him Dad once she hears what he's done. Did you, Dad? The first time he's accused by the inspector. And then finally at the end calling him Father, which is obviously a far less affectionate kind of term of address. So we see her growing distance from him, which arguably, again, if we think symbolically, is Priestley saying, young women need to distance themselves from the patriarchy. They don't need, babying by their daddies. They actually need to lead and to reject that kind of control in their lives. So she changes by the end. I think we've touched on this. Shall we move on to Eric? So Eric, a more ambiguous sort of character. Sheila's quite cut and dry, isn't she? We see her character arc very clearly. She's obviously a sort of good character almost from the start, whereas Eric is a lot more slippery, I think, in terms of how we see him.
And I think in many ways you need to remember that this is a time of kind of flux, and he's got no place in society. His father runs the factory, his father doesn't trust him, he doesn't really have a role in the Burling Empire at the moment, and he's one of these young men who are floating around, drinking, I think he's sleeping around. He is not kind of got a pivot in his life, he hasn't got anywhere to kind of hold himself, and the First World War was a big kind of changing point for that, because lots of these young men were killed and they were lost, okay? And actually their value in society was constantly seen, that they were needed. And then in the 1920s, and a little bit in the 1930s, where you had that last hurrah for people like Eric, where they could go out and they could enjoy this excess drink and that. But actually, Eric's having all this early when he realises this time is going to come to an end. You can't live this kind of life. You can't live this kind of pointless existence of not working, not having any kind of direction. And Missy is absolutely exactly that.
And I think it's worth making a note at this point as well of the link between Eric and this motif of alcohol that repeats and recurs throughout the play. So the very first thing we hear about is the kind of demand for port. It's framed as a question, but it's actually an instruction or a demand. So on the one hand, we've got Burling bringing us the port, Edna, then answering his own question, representing, the upper classes speaking, or the middle classes, as Burling is, of course, the industrialist, taking the voices of and speaking for the working class, like Edna, who doesn't get a chance to answer, she just expects to comply. But we've also got the introduction of the idea of alcohol being associated with moral corruption, or moral kind of dereliction. Like, he doesn't, at the beginning of the play at least, show any kind of moral character whatsoever, Burling or Eric. And Eric's greatest fall, if you like, his worst moment in the play, the rape of Daisy Renton, as she is by that time, or in fact, I don't think we know, he never even knows her name, does he? At that point, that's fueled by alcohol, we're led to suggest. He says he doesn't even remember it, and he was in that state when a chap can turn nasty. And what he means is drunk and aggressive. And that kind of suggestion marries easily with what we know about Priestley, which was, like many people in the north of England at that time, from the kind of background that he was from, he was a Methodist. And Methodists are Protestants who reject the drinking of alcohol and sign a pledge to vow never to touch a drop of it, on the grounds that alcohol leads to, the depth of morality and decision-making, essentially, which is exactly what he proves. So you might argue that while in the main, this is a piece of political propaganda, this play, it also has a thread of religious instruction running through it as well. It reinforces the sort of religious education that Priestley himself probably had at Sunday school and, within his family home, which is, alcohol leads to sin, and the kind of exploitation of women especially is often fueled by abuse of alcohol, which is the sort of thing, again, that he would have seen in the place where he'd grown up, and what it could lead to, I suppose.
I was thinking about what Miss was saying about Sheila being cut and dry, and she is very easily able to kind of overcome her mistake and find the next step. And there's definitely a symbolic level that it's Eric who can overcome it and accept his mistake, but he does it in such a more complex way, and he struggles so much more with that. And is there an idea that this is because these problems have come from the actions of men and the patriarchy, and he is part of that, whereas Sheila has still been a victim of the patriarchy in many ways, so it's easier for her to overcome that, because he hasn't caused most of these problems. Whereas Eric and the world he's kind of lived in, they have caused those problems.
Yeah, and I mean, the idea of the patriarchy permeates the whole play, doesn't it? Because it's about system of power driven by men passed from father to son. And it's Burling's sort of preoccupation with that in the beginning that's led to this engagement dinner in the first place, because he wants his daughter married to Croft's son to reinforce his own power by linking him to another powerful family. So it's repeating a trope that we've seen for hundreds, even thousands of years, of women, girls of Sheila's sort of age being used as sort of pawns and political figures to make alliances with other powerful families. Like Priestley shows us, like, it was ever thus, basically. The rich have always done this. They've always lived like this. And it seems as though, again, it's that sort of proto-feminist message, like he wants to reject all of that. In part, probably, because the patriarchal system, as he would have seen it, the system of male power, is bound up with a very particular part of men. And for him, it's tied to the establishment, which is just the word we give to, basically, the rich and powerful people who are in charge, who are, in this country at least, invariably, especially in that period, white men. And he sees that kind of the maleness of it as being tied inexorably to the money side of it. These are rich people, and these are people who went to the same kind of schools, the same kind of universities, came from the same kind of backgrounds. And that's almost why he's so appalled by Burling, and why Burling gets such a rough ride, because Burling, he almost suggests, should know better. He hasn't come from that kind of background. He's not university educated. He hasn't inherited his money the way Eric, Gerald and the rest have. He's worked for it, arguably, but what he asks us as the audience question is, has he actually worked for it, or has he just made it off the backs of poor women like Eva? Has he just exploited the poor and their labour to get what he's got?
And a classic kind of criticism of capitalism, of those who rise up the ladder kick those down to keep themselves up there, and he's very much aware of he needs to keep those people down to maintain his position.
And yet Eric kind of rejects that, doesn't he? So very early on, Eric's gut reaction to hearing about Eva is, I would have kept her on. Why couldn't you have given them a pay rise? But he doesn't have the same cutthroat capitalist instincts that his father has. And that's problematic, and it's suggested, isn't it, that that's kind of part of the issue with their relationship is he's not towing the line, he's not embracing capitalism in the right way. And in fact, it's sort of humanising the women, which is a problem because that's not how the system works. Should we
move on?
Yeah, I think so. So Eric overall then, he represents educated young men, and he represents potentially, like Sir said, that generation of young men who were lost, you know, those who went away to war and never came home, possibly, or indeed those who, like he does in the play, go away for a period and come back changed, because he returns, doesn't he, at the start of the third act, a different person, arguably. So Gerald.
Oh. Yeah, Gerald is the character to really go to town with, because he is very much a facade of a character who would like to present himself as caring, emotional, kind of fakes, to me anyway, fakes this emotional response to the news about Daisy Renton, but it's all about self-preservation for him. He is probably more so than Mr. Burling trying to protect himself and his reputation, and he is one of those rats who will disappear at moments of stress. He's vacant for quite a lot of the play, where he disappears, and we were talking about this last week, how he gives that premise of disappearing because he needs some time to think, but actually he's gone off hunting for a solution to this. He's trying to find out that the inspector is fake, and he's not really bothered about what he's done to Daisy Renton. He's not bothered about that at all. He's trying to find a solution to preserve where he is in this very kind of complex situation.
Which he does, of course, and then Mrs. Burling kind of says, "Oh, how clever of you, Gerald," because, of course, it is clever of him. You know, he's worked it out, hasn't he? And actually, his solution does get them all off the hook temporarily. And I think it's important to consider the way Priestley sets us up with these characters, some of whom we hate, some of whom we quite come to like. But he suggests that there are some people in life, and these people are symbolic of them, who have potential, and can change. So Sheila is a good example. She changes very quickly. It only takes for her to basically hear some interesting ideas that for her to change her entire outlook and sort of worldview. And the inspector's, you know, kind of impressed by that, isn't he? He says, you know, we often do make an impression on the young ones. He recognises that. But then there are the Geralds of the world, who Priestley suggests will never change. Because why would they? Because they're going to inherit the earth, aren't they? He's the absolute luckiest, tiniest sliver of a demographic in the world, isn't he? He's young, he's white, he's male, he's rich, he's upper class, he's titled, he's got the factory to sort of fuel his lifestyle, he's got the young women who are going to be queued up to want to marry him, to bear his children, to keep quiet about any misdemeanours that he makes. So why on earth would Gerald change? What does he want to change? The world is absolutely handed to him on a plate. So Priestley is essentially telling us, don't bother trying to convert these people, because you never will. They're just going to have to get theirs in the end somehow. But we're never going to change their mind. What we have to focus on instead are the Erics and Sheilas of the world, who have potential to change, and more importantly, this is quite a modern idea actually, to amplify the voices of the underprivileged, to be allies essentially to the poor. They're never going to know what it feels like to be poor, but they can be sympathetic, like Priestley himself was, and dedicate their lives to amplifying those voices and speaking for them when they can't speak
Absolutely.
for themselves.
If you think about the fact, I mean, we look at parallels between characters all the time, and if you think about Eric and Gerald, Eric is pulled up, like we said all the time, about his drinking and his acts, what he's done with Daisy. But it's all underplayed massively for Gerald, isn't it? He's been at the bar, okay, and he could only have gone there for one reason, wasn't it? Or two reasons. He's gone there to drink. He's gone there to potentially seek out a prostitute, okay? And that is swept under the carpet, and symbolically, characters like Gerald are there to maintain the status quo. There's absolutely no kind of question about that. And like this is saying, that Gerald is Teflon man, okay? Everything will wipe clean off him, everything's okay. And it's this idea that in 1912, they're untouchable. And it's what we call a hegemonic representation, this idea that it's the way it's always been, it's what everyone always assumes. They'd look at somebody like Gerald and go, he couldn't possibly have made this mistake, he couldn't have possibly done something wrong. Whereas Eric, you can understand why people would look at him and get it wrong in a different way.
I'm just going to note this term as well. It's useful when sometimes there's sort of thing, the Old Boys Club, and it refers to, Old Boys is the name that alumni of posh public schools and boarding schools use to describe the graduates of their school, or the alumni, the people who've passed through the best schools and most exclusive schools call themselves Old Boys, Eton Old Boys or Harrow Old Boys or whatever. So then there became this term, the Old Boys Club, which referred to men in positions of power like the judges, the doctors and surgeons and high-flying barristers who were going to go on to be judges, and those types of people who passed through those same schools. And Gerald belongs to that Old Boys Club, certainly, or he will as he advances in his life. Mr. Burling, though, doesn't and desperately wants to. And there's kind of moments of almost pathos where you feel sort of sorry for him because he's so desperate. Like, you ought to like this Port Gerald. It's the same one that your father gets. Like, he's trying to copy him. So lame. Because he wishes that he had that kind of class and that stuff came easily to him, but it doesn't. He's definitely faking it. And Priestley, we imagine, I think, reserves a special kind of disdain for people like that. Like, the real Old Boys Club are bad enough, but the people who aren't even part of it and are pretending are even worse.
Yeah, one of these.
Yeah, and Gerald, in that environment, like with, Alderman Meggetty with his fat old carcass, the suggestion is that all of these men who are in this palace bar with drinking with prostitutes, they're not poor men. These are the leading lights of the town. And notice that Mr. Burling is never surprised. Mr. Burling never says, "Oh, what were you doing in the palace bar?" He knows what it's there for as well. They're all in a sort of club with each other, where they routinely, seemingly, sit in their factories all day watching poor women work their fingers to the bone for their profit, and then they go and spend their profits on prostitutes and furthermore exploit those kind of poor women. And it's a real scathing indictment.
This is seen as something to be revered by people like Mrs. Burling, who they will know all about this, they will know it's happening, but they don't speak about it. And the fact it's just kind of accepted, it's unquestioned the entire time. And Priestley's pretty forward-thinking with this, because we see this a lot in today's society, don't we? Now, criticism of old order and privilege and kind of self-preservation, that's a word, people looking out for each other. And actually, in 1945, 1946, Priestley's saying we've got no room for that whatsoever. We can't look after ourselves. We are members of one body, and if we don't, if we start to think about ourselves individually, we're going to die. This body is going to die. We're out of time, so let's just
I think we are. I was just going to say, as a last thing as you were speaking, it occurred to me that there's a moment where Sheila says that her friend, do you remember who the suggestion being is another well-bred young lady, has had contact with this Alderman Meggerty, and she says something like she escaped with just a torn blouse. So she's essentially describing an attempted rape, maybe, certainly a sexual assault. And her mother's reaction is like, Sheila, you know, like with a kind of shock and horror, as in stop saying this.
Not that it's happened.
Yeah, of course. Not that Alderman Meggerty has attacked this girl, just don't talk about it, don't bring that to the surface. And I think, well, it's really forward thinking, isn't it? This is Priestley kind of in a very early, like, Me Too way, suggesting, no, the voices of young women's experiences are important and that they should be spoken aloud.
We haven't even spoken about Eva, particularly, or we haven't even spoken about the Inspector. But obviously we know that Eva, you understand Eva through all the other characters, the fact that she is voiceless. Okay, from there. Right, I think we'll have to let you go.
Yeah,
But thank you
very much.